Alrighty then, everybody. I'm obviously Jesus. Welcome to the first Patreon video for May 2019. I just took a big old shit. It's a beautiful day outside, and I'm ready to kill God. No, actually, I'm ready to talk about the role of marriage or the function of marriage and what purpose that idea serves in a world where, or for a person where, you don't believe in God, you don't believe in the institutions that marriage, spawned from back in like the old medieval days where it was more about, joining houses and resources and forming, alliances with other families and other countries and stuff like that. So I'm here to ask and answer one very simple question, kind of ambiguously maybe, but what role does marriage have for somebody with no connection whatsoever to the institutions that spawned it? So that's what I want to look at today. So let's get to it. Marriage is, of course, rooted in all sorts of religious and contractual traditions. So what the hell why the hell do I want to get married so badly? And as much as I do want to be married, and I have wanted to get married to somebody I love since I was like 16, essentially, I do find it hard to come up with an immediate justification for it, acknowledging, as I do, that it comes from traditions that really have no bearing on my actual life and probably shouldn't mean anything to me at all. So I suppose my first instinct in response to the question of why I still want to get married is to say that, maybe it's kind of the same reason that vegans want cultured meat, or they want stuff that tastes like meat, like the Impossible Burger, like a really, really good facsimile of something that they're missing and giving up on. I think it essentially goes back to, we just don't want to be excluded from nice things, even if in order to get that nice thing, you actually have to get just something that's just incredibly similar but fundamentally different in a certain way. And I think that rings doubly true for me because I've always been a person who is very sensitive to exclusion. I don't want to feel like I'm missing out on something good, even if it's a rational thing. I don't want to, especially in something that's meant to last your whole life, I don't want to, look around and see other people having this nice thing. And even though I can rationally understand that it has no real meaning, and it just comes from a purely traditional standpoint, it's still something that brings other people joy, and that I don't want to miss out on, even if I have to, acknowledge or, do something in a way that's fundamentally different to get something similar. And that, I think, explains some of it, especially for me. Some of the ceremonies, I'm not about the ceremony of marriage. Whenever I've thought about, getting married, I very rarely have ever thought about any kind of ceremony. I certainly don't have any, family members or friends that I would want to invite, really. But, I don't think about ceremony when it comes to marriage. I'd be happy getting like a Ron Swanson wedding from Parks and Rec, just having, one witness and the officiant in a courthouse or something, or wherever the hell it's supposed to happen. But, some people I think don't want to miss out because they want the excuse to have the ceremony. But it doesn't explain, I think, none of this explains why it really has to be codified into a law. Why is there a specific emphasis on the law? Because that's the only place where marriage is fundamentally different than just looking somebody in the face and saying, oh, well, I commit to you for the rest of my life. Why is it necessary to codify that legally when you can't just sit down and have a conversation with somebody and just say that to them and commit to them in a conversation, and say, oh, let's commit to each other for the rest of our lives? Why does it have to go to a legal place? And the initial answer I think that most people would probably give to this question is that, they would say that they really just want to show their devotion to the other person. But really, when you think about it, what relevance does law have to that devotion? If the law told you to not be devoted to that person, would you suddenly stop being devoted to them? No. Then, why does the law enhance the devotion when you acknowledge that it can't detract from the devotion? That to me seems a little bit incongruous. I suppose one possible explanation for this is that people want to, quote unquote, shout their love from the rooftops and simply express it to everyone and in every way possible, which I guess is understandable. And, in this case, the public record of marriages is serving as a metaphorical rooftop in addition to whatever ceremony you might have. But surely not everybody sees the public record or any kind of legal record really as an important important or really even values being seen in public. As I said before, there are some people who want fairly private and insular weddings. So again, this doesn't explain why it has to be codified into law, or why the law, even if you do view it as the rooftops is like a sufficiently public place, because it's not like anybody beyond your local newspaper is going to see it in the marriages records anyway. So that to me doesn't fully satisfy that question either of why it has to be a legal thing. I suppose the obligatory dismal read of this is that it's about some kind of legal possession, and you can certainly read it in a sexist way that goes back to that sort of contractual tradition of marrying your offspring off to unite families and create strategic alliances, like they did a lot in Europe in the Middle Ages and medieval times and whatnot. Where the man controls not only more assets, it's all about aggrandizing power for families led by patriarchs more often than not. And in a modern setting, it's much more about the tradition where women take the men's last names, which I have never been a fan of. I suppose it's possibly motivated by the fact that I have a very fucking stupid last name that I wouldn't wish on anybody. But there are certainly marriages, and I'm not the only man who has no interest in a woman taking his last name. That to me seems just crazy. I mean, maybe if somebody out there is married or understands this better than I can, you can illuminate me and enlighten me as to why this is appealing. But to me, it's always seemed very strange. Like when you meet a woman that as a man, when you meet a woman as a man, like you meet them and they have this name, and you get to know them under that name. And, not like a name is particularly important to your understanding of that person, but you meet them with this name. It just seems very, very strange that you would want to change that. I think there has to be like a degree of narcissism that you want to take this name of this person that you fell in love with and change it and simply overwrite it or like augment it with yours, which that does seem to me a little bit sexist, although I suppose there are men who occasionally take women's names, which seems a little odd as well, or they like merge each other's names. I don't know. I just don't know why, you would bother. I mean, certainly having a name change is kind of a pain in the ass legally, because you've got to like do all your legal documents and fucking, change your IDs and your credit cards and whatnot. But it just seems like not only a logistical hassle for those kind of nitty gritty reasons, but also it just seems weird that you fall in love with somebody with this one name and you then want them to change it after X amount of years being together and you want it to be different for the rest of your life. That just seems kind of weird to me. But and while you can definitely read a sexist sort of thread into that, and that is certainly accurate in a lot of cases, not all men want that. Not all women are willing to take men's last names, and yet all those people, there are still plenty of people who don't believe in those things. They get married anyhow. So that sort of possessive way of reading marriage and marriage's function in the modern world doesn't account for all cases either. So I don't really know that there's been any explanation that I've thought of so far that sufficiently answers the question of why this has to be codified into law. In the end, though, I really don't know why marriage is the way it is. Like I said, I think that I think it probably has something to do with the fact that it's simply just what's done as tradition. It's what, most of our parents did. It's what, a lot of people, especially around my age, 26, like a lot of your peers wind up doing. It's just something that you don't want to feel excluded from, even if you don't necessarily have any connection whatsoever to the origins of the institution of marriage. So, while I absolutely have no problem with people who say they don't want to get married and would rather just commit to somebody in a private conversation, I think that, in the end, people like me who still do want to get married despite not wanting to possess their partner in a legal way or caring about anything religious or, caring about anything, contractual in terms of like expectations from each other. I think that in a way, it goes back to my video about where I responded to Abaliciel's thoughts on replacing Christmas, where I argued that, rather than replace Christmas, we can simply take something that has bad origins or bad connotations or comes from a negative place or comes from, like Christmas does, a sort of negative tradition, and we can take one, aspect of it, whether it be marriage or celebrating Christmas, and we can essentially gut it and strip out all the bad stuff and say that we're just going to take out the bad stuff and keep in the good stuff. And this is going to be, and we're just going to call it the same thing. We're not going to, go through the trouble of renaming it and, trying to make society accept this newly renamed thing. We're just going to make a fundamentally better, absent, hopefully, of all the bad traditions and the bad stuff and the bad connotations that once affected marriages. We're just going to take out all the bad stuff. We're going to call it the same thing, and hopefully it's going to be good. And we're going to be committed to each other on all possible levels, even if, one of those levels, the legal level, doesn't really matter except for, taxes and shit. I mean, some people do get married for taxes, I suppose. I think that's, maybe in the case of like immigration, or maybe in the case of, I think people used to get gay married for tax reasons or something. But, regardless of any, tax reasons or anything like that, while being legally recognized as married doesn't really affect your interpersonal, relationship, and I don't think marriage needs to be treated like you're fundamentally different one day than you were before, the day after you get married versus the day before. I think it's perfectly fine to just say that, this is what society recognizes, and I want to feel like I have some participation in this, even though I'm going to, it means fundamentally something different to me than it means to a lot of other people, and than it used to mean to, people decades and centuries ago. But now, essentially, for the second part of the video, I want to take, a different tack. I want to look at, not whether or not marriage is still valuable to people who want to get married, but whether or not it's advisable for people to get married and for most people to seek lifelong commitments. Because I think, generally speaking, most people would be better served by retooling their ideas of marriage and of monogamy in general. I think many people wind up in long-term relationships, or what they intend to be long-term relationships, not because they're like me and their brains are truly kind of weird and crave that one individual connection with another unique person and work that way. I don't think that's how most people operate. I think a lot of people, especially if you're cisgender and heterosexual, wind up trying to get in long-term relationships and marriages because of societal and family expectations. It's still not uncommon, even in this day and age, to say, oh, well, when are you going to give me grandkids? It's not uncommon to hear your parents say that. Thankfully, my parents have never said that to me, because they at least understand, if not agree with, my position on natalism and my opposition to it. But like I said, if you're a cis-het person, you generally are still expected to, eventually, sooner or later, grow up and settle down and raise a family at some point in your life, but especially settle down, even if you decide not to have kids. But honestly, I think that a lot of people would fare better by, when they're younger, intentionally having shorter relationships and being honest that they're not ready to get married or make a long-term commitment yet. And ultimately, even when they're older, I think people would fare better just having the ultimate goal of perhaps finding a longer-term partner that they like more than most other people, and perhaps cohabitating with them, but still having a somewhat open relationship with a transparency of information between the two, long-term partners, but still having an open relationship where, both people admit that, you might want to see other people to fulfill some kind of, other type of emotional or sexual needs. Because, expecting, for most people, I think, even though I don't really understand polyamory at all, or polygamy, really, I don't understand it. It doesn't appeal to me. I have no idea, what makes a person think that, they're going to have, the ability to have multiple sexual partners in the same time of their life. I mean, maybe this is something that's more, understandable, by attractive people, I guess. But, even though I don't understand these things completely, I think that, most people would fare better attempting them. And ultimately, like I said, having a longer term, partner cohabitative relationship, but still, acknowledging that for most people, the one single other person cannot be the end all and be all. And so having a somewhat open relationship where information and, consent and, approval and whatever you want to use. I don't know what terms are used in the polyamorous community, but, just being honest with each other about, who you're seeing and if you're seeing somebody else. But, having a long-term relationship supplemented by other people might be more akin to what most people need. I mean, I think the divorce rate in America right now is like something like 70%. Let's look up the most recent divorce rate in America. Divorce rate in America. It's 50%. It's about 50%. I actually thought it was higher. I think that some sources will give you as high as like 60, somewhere between like 55 and 65%. So it's pretty fucking dismal here in America is the point here. And, it's not much better in other places. I imagine that's better in places with, a higher, general happiness level, like, Denmark and, what's the word? Scandinavian countries. As well, but it's still not great all across the board, and I think it goes back to even more progressive and more fundamentally happier populations still having the same general monogamous expectations. And while I am a monogamous person, I will probably always be a monogamous person, and I will always want just that one connection because I feel like fundamentally that it's all I can get. And also, I mean, that kind of sounds like low self-esteem and depressing, which on one hand it is, but I also feel like it's what my type of brain wants. Like I just want to like lock in on another person and really just share my experience with them. And I don't think that I could. It's hard enough to do that with one person. It's hard enough to find somebody to do that with, clearly, as evidenced by my life experiences and all that I've talked about frequently here in this Patreon. I don't think I could achieve it with multiple. But I think if most people in the world were to have a dark night of the soul, so to speak, and ask themselves what they really want out of life, regardless of, any kind of societal or family expectation that was drilled into them at an early age and continually drilled into them across their whole lives, I think they would say something more similar to, I would want to have, or that they would want to have, multiple quality relationships, or have a relationship where most of their needs are met by one other person, but they could still explore other people and have relationships outside of that primary relationship. So I think that while it's certainly a far cry from what we have now, I think that would be a good change for most people. Not only because genetically speaking, people are wired to spread their genes with as many people as they possibly can, regardless of whether or not they're actually intending to produce. The impulse is still there from a basic genetic level to just have sex with as many people. And on a secondary level, men are men kind of receive varying societal conditioning about this. They're taught to eventually settle down, but they're also taught that having a lot of sexual partners, having a lot of female sexual partners, at least if you're heterosexual, is very cool and good. So they get a lot of mixed messaging about this, and I think that having a more polyamory accepting society would reduce how confusing that messaging winds up being if both options were accepted as okay. But regardless of just people wanting to breed and spread their wild oats, as they say, which is one of the all-time great euphemisms for cum, regardless of people wanting to spread those wild oats, on a higher mental level, I think having one relationship last the bulk of your life is simply not something people are ready for. Sustaining an intense, deep relationship is not easy, and it changes in ways. Research has shown that it changes in ways that people don't expect, and that ultimately leads to dissatisfaction in the marriage. Not only do relationships fundamentally change after about 7 years, where love goes from being romantic love to companionate love, even if that's coming and you're ready for that change, it doesn't mean that you won't grow apart, and it certainly doesn't even exclude the possibility that you'll grow apart even before that change. And that's why marriages in America, when they get divorced, they last about 7 to 11 years, because people hit that change, and regardless of how ready they are for it, it's still a very an unexpected thing for most people. And I think that no amount of preparation can safeguard you against the dissolution of a relationship, but I think that people are just generally unprepared on top of that. And this is why I think people who intend to have lifelong relationships need to have a slightly unconventional view of the world, like I do, to remain on the same page with somebody else, or mostly on the same page with somebody else for a lifetime, or half your lifetime, or most of your adult lifetime. You have to be truly committed to each other in a way that goes beyond truly anything else. You truly have to, like I said, have a dark night of the soul and say, I'm putting this person and our relationship and our togetherness above literally everything else, regardless of money, careers, education, what our families might say or advise, sickness and health. Like, you truly have to internalize all of that. You have to put yourself and this other person on an equal pedestal above everything else in life. And that is not easy in practice for most people. You might think that you love somebody more than anything in the world, and you might have this great, honeymoon phase of the relationship and get married and then go on your literal honeymoon and, just feel so great about this person. But eventually the rest of life is probably going to set back in, and you're going to be thinking about, you're going to be, getting absorbed in the realities, the day-to-day life of, work and money, and these things can, drag people in different directions. And I think that's ultimately what happens with most people. I just looked it up. 50% of people or more get divorced, and they get torn apart, and they get pulled in different directions because their commitments ultimately are not stronger than all the different, forces and inputs and impetuses that, life is giving, and the stimuli that life is giving you to pull you in ultimately probably different directions. And it's worth noting, I think, that, all of this is a very, very fucking good reason to not have kids. Children definitely need the influence of more than one adult in their lives on a permanent basis. They need two parents, regardless of what gender those parents happen to be. But many times we see that the typical course of life is to pull people apart because of these more practical concerns in different directions. So to raise a child when the national average length of a marriage is 7 to 11 years seems to be fucking quite irresponsible, when they need at least 18 years of intensive care, and you need to be able to, not only raise a child and care for them, but you also need to maintain your relationship throughout, not only for each other's sake, but for the sake of that child and the environment they grow up in. So, that's probably why I'm not really angry so much at my parents for getting a divorce anymore. I'm just angry at them for having children. They could have, if they didn't have me, they could have split, they could have tortured each other forever. None of it would have been my concern. So ultimately, I think that, this lack of readiness on the part of the general population, as we can see, and just from a basic statistical level, is pretty depressing, and a very, very good argument for not having kids. Because if most things fall apart after around like 10 years, how are you going to care for a child for 18 years? That seems fucking crazy to me. But, I would definitely encourage anybody to, examine their ideas of monogamy and marriage, and ask themselves if that's what they truly want. If they truly want to strip away everything else in the world and have that other person as essentially their guiding light, their North Star. Although it's not like, one person is leading the other really, so much as it is you're attached to each other in like a dual orbit type thing. And for most people, while I'm perfectly happy being that way, and I don't think it's very likely, but I hope to, still, again, I hope against hope to find that for myself one day. I think most people will be happier, having a more fluid, a more adaptive view of relationships, and society would be much better, and that we would see, much more general, higher levels of happiness if people were to be more accepting of the natural impermanence and, of relationships, and having multiple relationships that fulfill different needs at different times. Do I think we're going to get there anytime soon, though? Absolutely not, because America, if nothing else, is fucking completely and totally resistant to change in all their values, political and social. So this is just me theorizing. But yeah, I've been obviously Jesus. Thanks very much for watching. Your music recommendation of the week is UFOF by Big Thief, which is fucking fantastic. Just go listen to it. Get your Spotify or Apple Music or whatever you have out. Anyway, I will see you next week. I have no idea what we'll be talking about, so please leave suggestions in the comments section. Bye-bye.